皆様お待たせいたしました。
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Let us start the program. This is session number 4, where we will be talking about the future of renewables, the future of energy. I'd like to call upon Dr. Eric Martineau, Research Director, Institute for Sustainable Energy and Policies. Eric, please.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to session number 4 on the future of renewable energy. We're here to discuss the future of renewable energy both globally and here in Japan. We have 3 speakers today. Myself, I'll be talking about my new work, the Renewables Global Futures Report. We have Steve Sawyer, Secretary General of the Global Wind Energy Council. And we have Thomas Kahlberger, Chairman of the Executive Board of the Japan Renewable Energy Foundation. It should be an interesting discussion. So let me start things off. So I'm going to talk about the future of renewable energy based on a report that I just finished called the REN 21 Renewables Global Futures Report. One of the messages that I have for you today is that the thinking about the future of renewable energy in Japan is really 10 to 20 years out of date. Japan is really thinking about renewable energy as if it were still 1995 or the year 2000, for example, and I'll get to that at the end. Before I talk about the future, however, I would like to talk for a few minutes about the present situation, and we've heard a lot about that today. But for 6 years, I wrote the Renewables Global Status Report, which explains where we are today, and I think many of you now realize that renewable energy provides 20% of global electricity, which is more than nuclear. And I think also you're aware that renewable energy is the fastest growing energy technology in the world. We've seen growth rates of 20 to 70% annually over the last 7 or so years. Solar PV grew by 75% in the year 2011. And other technologies growing equally as fast. I think we'll hear more about solar, but the market for solar has been 30 gigawatts per year for the last 2 years. That's almost the entire capacity of TEPCO. So that's growing very fast. And the investment picture, I think, is also quite interesting. $260 billion invested in renewable energy in 2011. That's 7 times more than was invested in 2004. And that investment continues to grow. In fact, more money is invested in renewable energy today than fossil fuel and nuclear combined. So renewable energy is now the majority of investment in the power sector globally. And that surprises many people. If you look at where that investment is going, China, the US, Germany, and Italy took the majority of investment in 2011. Japan was about $6 billion, or about half that of India. And there are many policies around the world now. 120 countries around the world have policies to promote renewable energy. So it's a very strong picture of where we stand today. And again, many people do not realize how significant and mainstream renewable energy has become. So let me get back to the future now. In this report, after writing about the current situation for so many years, I decided I wanted to write about the future of renewable energy, but not just talk about one vision or my own thoughts, but I wanted to have a very comprehensive picture of what everyone is thinking about now in terms of what the future looks like. And so to do that, I traveled around the world and I personally interviewed 150 people, experts, leading experts in the field, about what they thought was the future of renewable energy. And that was 1,000 pages of interview notes. And we also looked at 5,000 pages of recent scenarios for the future of renewables and energy from a variety of organizations like the International Energy Agency, Greenpeace, and academics, and put all that together. So if you read the report, you can get the benefit of my work over 2 years. You get 170 people that you won't have to talk to yourself, and 5,000 pages of scenarios that you will not have to read yourself. And what took me 2 years to do, you can get in 2 hours of reading. So the report is available on the web now in both English and Japanese, and I do have copies of it here. I'm happy to hand them out at the end if you want one, a printed copy. So what does the report talk about? Well, I'm just going to highlight a few things, and I'm going to do this in terms of Japan and the myths that I think exist here about renewable energy. So when I say myth, it's something that we believe, but it's really not true. So first of all, the experts and scenarios really are pointing to futures in which renewable energy is a very high share. So at least 30, 40, 50% shares of energy from renewables in the far future are now seen as not just possible, but very likely or almost certain to happen. And that's confirmed, I think, when you look at what we've heard today. In Germany, the target is 80% share of electricity. That's some of these policy targets for shares of electricity. In Denmark already it's up to 50%, and you can look at the daytime supply in Germany, and in Spain was actually recently, 45% share from wind power. So these high shares of renewables are already occurring, and a future with high shares is really not just possible, but expected. So low shares, 15, 20%, really are not credible anymore. I think the myth number one here in Japan is that the future of renewables will remain at the low level, that there will not be high shares, and I think that myth is simply not true any longer in view of all of the scenarios and all of the expert opinion which points to high shares, at least in the 30 to 50% range, and even leading to 70 and 80% in the longer term. Secondly, experts and scenarios point to very high levels of investment in the future. So we can see projections of $400 billion annually by 2020, $500 billion by 2025, estimates of average investment in renewable energy up to $1 trillion per year over the next 20-year period. That's in the Greenpeace scenario. And so you see these very high levels of investment in future projections. And myth number two here, I think, in Japan is that renewable energy investment will remain small, and I think that myth is no longer true either if you look at the experts and the scenarios. And also experts pointed to many new sources of finance for renewable energy, for example, pension funds, insurance funds, community funds, oil companies themselves. And experts also pointed to many new types of business models that will facilitate those flows of finance. And I won't go into this, but very interesting new kinds of business models, new opportunities to make money from renewables. And then the report also points to the roles of different types of existing companies. So, example, we've heard a lot from electric utilities today, and the roles of electric utilities as power managers of a complex grid system with distributed generation, centralized storage, flexibility, modularity, sort of multi-level grids. This is a new role for electric utilities to manage, as well as the whole challenge of balancing. And so one of the really interesting things to come from the report is that energy storage is really not necessary to balance large shares of renewable energy. And I think this is a third myth here in Japan, is that energy storage is necessary for renewable energy to achieve high shares, but that's simply not true, because there are a dozen other options for balancing renewable energy on power grids, and all of these options are already being used today by utilities around the world, and the utilities in Denmark, in Germany, in Spain are underway in already implementing these options for high shares in the future. So energy is not really necessary, but energy storage is not really necessary, and I think that's another myth here in Japan, and that really points to the new role for electric utilities that we've been discussing here today. Role for oil companies, of course, in terms of investment, in terms of biofuels, in terms of offshore wind power development using their logistical expertise. Roles for automakers in developing the next generation of electric vehicles that can run on renewable electricity. Many different types of vehicles. I think we heard this morning from Amory Lovins. Light vehicles made of carbon fiber, two-wheelers, three-wheelers, many different sizes. No one size fits all anymore. And this is a major role for auto companies. If we think about the role for IT companies, so IT companies have a large role in many of the grid technologies we've talked about, the so-called smart grid technologies. In balancing large shares of renewables, there's a large role for IT in all of these options, as well as the fact that the wind industry, I actually had the opportunity to interview Mr. Ditlev Engel for this report. He was one of those 150 people I spoke with. That the wind industry is now a major user of supercomputer power for all of its, not just for design, but for all of its functions. And so the role for IT companies in all of this. And then, of course, the role for building materials manufacturers in terms of building technologies and low energy carbon neutral buildings fueled and heated and cooled from renewable energy, geothermal, biomass, and solar, and the role of existing companies that are manufacturing building materials and heating components, heating, ventilating, cooling systems for commercial buildings, for example, to integrate renewable energy into those existing technologies. These opportunities are huge. Solar glass for architectural design as a standard item in catalogs is one point that an expert made that we will soon see in these next 10 years, building material manufacturers offering solar glass in their catalog. So really a whole range of roles for existing companies. Well, just to mention that I've covered 3 myths. I think the 4th and the 5th myth about renewable energy here in Japan is one that renewable energy costs more, and also that there's not enough land in Japan to support renewable energy. And I think both of those myths are also not true. We've heard a lot of talk today about the low cost of wind power now becoming competitive with coal and natural gas in a growing number of markets and situations. The issue with wind power in Japan is really not about land area. It is, however, about transmission capacity, about coexistence with agriculture and zoning, about transmission unbundling and the transmission marketplace. So all of these things really are relevant to wind power development, but not land use. If we think about solar PV, same thing. The cost of solar panels is now $1 per watt. That's 3 times less than it was even 4 years ago. And $1 per watt was considered the holy grail of solar PV in the 1980s. We used to say if solar PV came down to $1 per watt, then solar would be used everywhere. The game would be over. And we're there now. In fact, $1 per watt in 1980 dollars is only about 50 cents or less today. So in fact, we've gone past $1 per watt in the dollars of the 1980s. And we see this so-called grid parity of solar PV being competitive with retail electricity prices spreading around the world, sort of a growing wave of so-called grid parity where solar PV is competitive directly, even without subsidies. And also the myth that there's not enough land for solar PV. I think most of us recognize the opportunities for solar PV, not just on rooftops, but everywhere. This sort of solar layer on top of everything else everything here in Japan is sort of vertically built, and you can have a solar layer on top of everything else, from parking structures and highways to a variety of public buildings and facilities. So I think the myth that there's not enough land area is also very clear now that this is simply not true. So to conclude, let me just say I wanted to also point to a list of so-called great debates. This is in your slide packet. But the report and the interviews with experts pointed to a number of these so-called great debates. Like, what are we talking about right now with regard to renewable energy? And I think almost all of these debates really are relevant to the situation here in Japan. And if you think about these 5 myths that I've talked about that really are no longer true, number 1, that renewable energy will remain a small share of the future. Number 2, that renewable energy investment will never get large. Number 3, that energy storage is necessary for high levels of renewables. Number 4, that renewable energy costs more. And number 5, that Japan doesn't have enough land area. All of these reflect thinking which is really 20 years old. And so you find that today. And that's when I say that our thinking here in Japan, the thinking here in Japan is 10 to 20 years out of date. If we bring the thinking here to the current reality, the current situation, the current way that we're looking at the future, then I think the situation could be very different. Japan could be a real leader in the world in renewable energy, actually quite easily, with changes in policy and business opportunities, business models. I've lived here in Japan for the last 4 years, and I consider this to be my home now, and I would like to see Japan become a leader, and I think we can all work towards that goal. So thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Steve Sawyer from the Global Wind Energy Council. You have a long, detailed statistical presentation from me in your pack, so therefore I don't need to give it. And I will emphasize a few points and then make some observations about the future of both of wind power and the renewable energy sector generally, and then a little bit about Japan. And then hopefully we can hear from Thomas and have some discussion. We might even find something to argue about. The wind power industry is certainly not a small industry anymore. Total investment last year was in the vicinity of $75 billion US dollars. The sector employs about 700,000 people and installed about 45 gigawatts of new capacity last year, which was about a 10% increase over what we did in 2011, for a cumulative increase of somewhere in the vicinity of 20%. You saw the investment numbers that Eric put up there in terms of the overall renewable energy sector, and the preliminary indications we have from Bloomberg is that actual total investment in 2012 was down a little bit on what it was in 2011, not because less renewable electricity generation capacity was installed, but because prices have come down so much. And we hear a lot about the dramatic pricing decreases in solar technology, which is a wonderful thing. And in wind, there have been less dramatic but significant price decreases from technology improvements. There's continuous improvements. You heard Ditlev talk about one in terms of the new emphasis on machines that harvest economically effective quantities of energy from low wind regimes, but also because of intense market competition, because we have a situation where we have manufacturing capacity in the world at the beginning of last year of about 80 gigawatts, market of about 45, and so everybody's competing to try to get some of that 45 for their 80 gigawatts of manufacturing capacity, and that's leading to market consolidation that's going on, which makes it a tough time for turbine manufacturers, but it makes it a very good time for consumers, because the price of wind is now well, in many markets, it's the most inexpensive way to put new capacity on the grid. And that trend will continue, I think. I speak at a lot of conferences where everybody talks about what they can do to help renewable energy development in developing countries. From where I sit, the developing countries, for the most part, are doing pretty well. Yes, they need help, and the markets are increasing, and they have all the sorts of teething problems. But the big problems for us, for the wind sector, are not the developing countries. It's the OECD countries. It's the US, it's Canada, it's the UK, Canada, Japan, Australia. That's where the policy flip-flopping by government officials has made it very difficult for investors to decide whether or not to go there. And the two worst are the US and the UK, so I'll spend a minute on those. You may have followed the discussions at the end of the previous congressional session at the end of 2012 about whether the production tax credit for wind energy would be continued. And the wind industry and the governors of the states that have large wind sectors were arguing throughout 2012 that it should in fact be extended before the 11th hour, because the 85,000 people that were employed in the wind sector were going to start losing their jobs, as of course they did, many of them, and that there would be then a major collapse in the market in 2013. Well, all of that has come to pass, but on New Year's Day, early in the morning, Congress did in fact pass the extension of the production tax credit, so an awful lot of those people those 85,000 people, half of whom got pink slips in the second half of 2012, a lot of them have been hired back now. And the predictions of the drop-off in the U.S. market are nowhere near as dire now as they were 3 or 4 months ago. But as you heard from Ditlev, and the consensus from the green growth people is that's no way to run a business, that's no way to run the energy sector. And the UK, which has had one of the fastest growing wind energy markets in the world over the course of the last couple of years, the government has been setting about systematically destroying that over the course of the last 6 months in the name of electricity market reform, which is neither a market nor is it a reform, but it's basically a means to justify governments giving money to build new nuclear power stations while pretending that they're not in fact doing subsidies. And what they've done is completely undermine all investment in manufacturing capacity in the UK in the process. So in terms of having an incoherent energy policy or an undecided energy policy, Japan is by no means alone. But I would argue that the majority of those countries, which at least make a difference to our industry, are in the OECD, not in developing countries, where we're seeing big growth in places like Brazil and Mexico and now South Africa and Ethiopia and China and India have been driving the global market for the last 4 or 5 years. One of the things, we create some of those scenarios that Eric had to run through for his futures report, and one that we've been doing since 1999. It's now called the Global Wind Energy Outlook. Back the first version in 1999 was called Wind Force 10, where we projected that wind could supply 10% of global electricity supply by 2020, and everybody thought we were totally insane. The wind industry was pretty tiny in those days. In actual fact, the installations over the last 13 years now, or 14 years, have exceeded the projections we made in those days, and we're well on track to supplying somewhere between 8 or 9% in the moderate scenario, or 11 or 12% of global electricity supply by 2020. And we were on that advanced track for a very long time, but with the economic crisis and the oversupply in the industry and the policy uncertainty in certain key markets, and particularly the lack of demand growth in the OECD markets, we've sort of slipped off that advanced track in the last 2 or 3 years. And so what we've tried to isolate are some of the key policy things that we would need to get back on that advanced track to make the full contribution that we can make over the course of the next decade or so. Critical fixes in major markets like the US, if they would have an energy policy. If any of you know, there's a television show called The Daily Show in the US, which is sort of the alternative to Fox News, which Fox News makes up incredibly amazing nonsense from the left, from the right wing, and The Daily Show sort of tries to counter that from the left. And they have a little clip that they put together of every American president since Richard Nixon, saying how America needs a coherent energy policy to become independent of fossil fuels, reduce our emissions, and all the rest of these things. And it goes from Nixon to Ford to Carter to Reagan to Bush 1 to Bill Clinton, and then to Bush 2, and then to Obama, while the dependence of the U.S. on imports of foreign energy sources continues to increase from about 35% in 1973 to about 70% today. So that's one thing that needs to fix. China, which has been our biggest growth market over the last 5-6 years, has serious regulatory and grid issues at a different stage of what you're dealing with here in Japan, but of a similar character, and due to the intransigence of a state-owned utility transmission system operator, which doesn't like renewables. The European emissions trading system, which is a cornerstone of the European policy, is seriously dysfunctional at the moment because of all the free allocations that were given out in the first couple of rounds, and that needs to be fixed. And related to that is certainly, you hear an awful lot of talk about subsidies. And the only talk that I would urge you to pay attention to is coming from the chief economist of the IEA, Fatih Birol, who has become arguably the single most effective campaigner on climate change anywhere in the world these days. And he spoke at the European Wind Energy Association conference down in Vienna a couple of weeks ago, and pointed out that the G20 group got together in 2010 and came out with a communique saying that we really needed to do something about fossil fuel subsidies, which at that point were about $400 billion a year. So all governments went back to their capitals and made some noise about it, and then it all disappeared. Fossil fuel subsidies in 2012 were $560 billion US dollars, as opposed to that for wind, which was about 20. And an interesting way of expressing that is basically, while governments are trying to put a price on carbon, they are in fact subsidizing carbon emissions to the tune of $110 million, $110 per ton globally. So you can see why a price within the European emissions trading system of $20 a ton or $25 a ton, or it is now 5 or 7, doesn't do much when those same governments are in fact spending $110 a ton to encourage them to emit. So these are some of the issues that we need to, and also the de-risking of the investment models that Eric talked about in the report. For the future, I think we've heard a lot in the previous session about the nature of future electricity markets, flexibility of both supply and demand, driven by market forces, but heavily regulated and controlled by a responsible independent regulator. I think we're going to see the electrification of the energy supply in a much greater way than we have in the past, and breaking down the barriers between power generation on the one hand, transport on the other, and heating and cooling as the third. We'll see the electricity sector penetrating both transport and heating and cooling to a much greater degree than it has in the past. And the reason for that is that we have the technology now to economically decarbonize the electricity supply by the middle of this century. Whether we have the political will to do it or not is another thing, but it's quite clear that we have the technology to do so. And in the process, we're going to be generating a lot more electricity than we need, and it will be cheaper and more effective and cleaner to use that energy in other sectors, as is already beginning to happen in the transport sector in some places, and in the heating cooling sector, particularly in Scandinavia. Yes. What was my third point there? Oh, well, we're moving on to, okay, finally, climate, carbon, a price on carbon. This was a very central part of the energy debate in the run-up to Copenhagen in 2009, when we had our big damp squib and did not, in fact, agree on an effective post-2012 climate regime. But that issue is coming back to the table with the increasing evidence of climate impacts around the world and increasing public and scientific, the scientists are freaking out, basically, at what they're seeing in the Arctic, in the Antarctic, in the Amazon, and elsewhere. And politicians are not going to be able to argue that, are not going to be able to ignore that issue for very much longer. And there's a sort of target date for a new treaty of 2015. But I think the lesson that we've learned, at least, and I would suggest is one that we might all take to heart, is that in 2009 we were looking for politicians to lead. I think we've learned the hard way that the politicians aren't going to lead. We have to create the conditions which will allow them to move. So, and in fact, we in the industry have to be the leaders and create the space which will allow the politicians to safely move in the direction that we need to go to keep global mean temperature rise anything like the 2 degrees target which they've set themselves. So hopefully we can bring that discussion or play a positive role in that discussion in the run-up to 2015. In Japan, it seems to me that the fundamental problem is a political one. It's not a technological one. It's not an economic one. It's not even a technocratic one. It's a political one. And the one characteristic that you see in all of the countries where there has been a significant uptake and a dramatic increase in the penetration of renewable energy is where there is a clear political will expressed from central government that that's what they want to see happen, whether it be for climate reasons or local environment reasons or energy security reasons or security of price or macroeconomic security, whatever the combination of reasons that drives that. Without that political will from the top, you don't see the major change that needs to happen, like the Energiewende in Germany being the classic example. And we don't really see that in Japan. You see it in the public, but you don't see it from the government. And I'm afraid that until that changes, we're not going to see fundamental change in Japan. Although the unbundling process, which I understand is getting underway, I've seen a gentleman in the audience showed me the blueprints which Menti is working on now for that process. It's going to take 6 or 8 years, and that will help. But I don't think that the fundamental energy situation here is going to change until there is a fundamental political change. So I would submit to you that that is the bigger question, rather than fiddling around the edges of energy policy, that is going to make the difference here in Japan. And I'll end there.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Just one question. You mentioned political will and also, policy and institutional difficulties. Presuming that Japan does find that political will and does manage to go through those policy and institutional difficulties that would really lead to sort of a new era for wind power here. Could you give us like a 20-year perspective in terms of the wind market here in Japan relative to how you see that from the global wind energy outlook, and what would be Japan's role internationally in terms of how it would fit into that growing international market over the next 20 years? And if Japan doesn't take this opportunity and waits too long, what would be the result vis-a-vis the international market as well?
Well, we've heard from others who know more than I do about the details of the resources of the potential wind resources here in Japan. I know that there's a lot of potential in the short term that could be developed in Hokkaido if the transmission and the infrastructure were available. Also in the southern part of the country, and of course there's a tremendous nearshore offshore resource which could be developed, and Japan could and looks to be have its eye on at least becoming the leaders in commercializing the floating wind turbine technology, which would be a tremendous market niche to fill, not only here in Japan, but off the coast of Korea, certainly off the coast of the United States, and in some parts of Europe like Spain and Norway and whatever, where they don't have a shallow continental shelf. In terms of I don't have that worked out in what it could be in terms of megawatts, but my colleagues at the Japan Wind Energy Association will correct me, but I believe it could be 50 gigawatts by 2050. Yes, sorry. 50 gigawatts by 2050, roughly half onshore and roughly half offshore, and the majority of the offshore being of the floating type, if I remember it correctly. And I think, there are many Japanese companies that are both manufacturing turbines, but have expertise and engineering experience in the marine environment, which could be very, very useful in that way, and certainly across the electricity sector. But the question really is, what is the role of, assuming that some of the existing electricity companies survive an unbundling process as some sort of intact entities, what role are they going to play? Are they going to become the RWEs and Eons and Scottish and Southerns and the Arivas of Japan, who are traditional former parts of state-owned monopolies, or Dong Energy in Denmark, which are now the major investors in the renewable sector in that part of the world and spreading out internationally? Or are they going to be like some of the others, which I won't name, which are fading into the obscurity as historical artifacts, and an obscurity which is richly deserved? It's their choice. They're fighting it now. They will fight as long as they think they have a chance to win. But at some point, they'll read the writing on the wall and decide whether they want to survive in the power markets of the 21st century or go down fighting.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thomas, how do you see the future of renewable energy, and how do we get there?
I think you have done a very good job in your report to show very clearly that what has happened over the last decade in the renewable energy sector is dramatically more success than what was anticipated in the last part of the last century. I don't know of any wind power projection printed in the 20th century that shows a greater increase in wind power than what we have actually seen. And the reason for that, I believe, is that very few, if any, during the 20th century believed that China would be the world's leading wind power country in 2010 or even in 2029. And the Chinese development is, and I believe will be, decisive for the development of the renewable energy industry. I was, for some years before the last 5-year plan, member of one of the international advisory groups that the Chinese government had. We were asked to provide input into a low-carbon industrialization strategy for China. And what I learned during these years and these meetings was summarized actually at the final meeting before the 5-year plan was published, when I heard the Chinese describe that they intended to continue with 5, 10, 15% economic growth until 2020. They showed they had the ambition to be the world's leader in wind power, the world's leader in solar PV manufacturing, in installation, in solar water heaters, in electric vehicles. And they had been, before the Fukushima accident, also the country with the ambition to be world leaders in nuclear. They did not talk about that after Fukushima. And when I've seen the translations of the 5-year plan, which has projections until 2020, and then they changed from the previous 5-year plan in 2007, increasing the targets for hydropower by 20%, wind power from 30 to 200 gigawatt, for solar power from 180 megawatt to 50 gigawatt or more. And if you recalculate this into terawatt hours per year, it was an increase of more than 600, between 600 and 700 terawatt hours of new renewable capacity between for 2020 in the two 5-year plans. And seeing the real development and reading those plans, it is obvious that what they will do is to drive a large share of the industry, and by doing so they will decrease the cost of these renewable energy technologies. Their motive was that they saw that when they would have their 20 or 10, 5, 10, 15% economic growth until 2020, they would have to increase their imports of all fossil fuels. And they realized that if China is multiplying its import of oil, they would increase the world market price. If they did it with gas, they would increase the gas price. And China also started becoming a net importer of coal and has now become the largest coal importer in the world, of course affecting also the coal price. And their idea was that doing so, they would increase the world market price. So they needed also to be the most efficient country in the world, which they looked in the statistics and found that, oh, on average, they already were. Coal-fired power stations in China use less coal per kilowatt hour than coal-fired power stations on average do in Europe or the US, simply because they're newly built. So the Chinese are immensely important, and they will do what they plan to do, and they will gain in competitiveness in the process. And for people in Europe, as well as in North America, this poses a major challenge. We can enjoy the fact that China drives its economic growth in relatively environmentally friendly ways compared to what they could do. But as economic competitors, they are challenging, which may have the good consequence that you will see similar policies in Europe and the US. And was it now 2 weeks ago, President Obama presented his State of the Union speech, where he did talk rather well on energy issues, on energy efficiency, and also on renewable energies, where his statement was, as long as countries like China keep going all in on clean energy, so must we. And being proud of the fact that half of the new capacity in the US last year in electricity was wind power. I think this new situation where the major regions in the world are actually competing to be successful in renewable energy is one which will result in successful continued growth of renewables. I feel absolutely sure that also Japan will have a large share of renewable energy. The question is, will it be sooner or later? And that is the question that many countries in the world are now asking. And when asking that question, they're also looking for the policy measures that can yield success. And traditionally, it has been necessary to provide subsidies. And speeding up renewable energy deployment has been the same thing as increasing subsidies. Now, when the cost of renewables, bioenergy, wind and solar, has become so low that they are at or close to being able to compete with fossil fuels and certainly nuclear without any subsidies, and of course easy if you internalize external cost and tax carbon dioxide and so on, but also without that, they are competitive with conventional energy in the most successful countries. You realize that a very important thing to do is to minimize costs instead of increasing subsidies. So what I think is important in Japan, and what the Japan Renewable Energy Foundation is now trying to do, is to benchmark the performance of this industry in Japan to the best in the world. And where do we find the best in the world? Well, we have some indicative examples. We have seen in solar the development in Germany that has been very successful. They have learned to do solar efficiently. The feed-in tariff for solar in Germany is now between 15 and 20 yen per kilowatt hour, and they build approximately as much solar per month as Japan do per year. And the feed-in tariff in Japan is still twice as high. And it seems to be the cost level in Japan. So why are the costs so high? When you look at it, you find that there are some regulations making demands on professional electricians being available if you have a solar installation, for example, that drives up costs in an unnecessary way. It's costs made in Japan that should be avoided. But we must find them first and then try to remove them. If we look at wind power, the most spectacular low price or low cost I've seen is the result of the Brazilian procurement of new power capacity in December. I mentioned it earlier, the Brazilian government managed to buy wind power at about 4 yen per kilowatt hour. In Sweden, we build more wind power per capita than anyone else in the world. We have a total price for wind power of 8 yen per kilowatt hour. We built 10 times as much wind power last year as Japan did, despite the fact that the feed-in tariff in Japan is 3 to 6 times as high as Brazil and Sweden. If we do it on a per capita basis, we built 100 times more wind power than Japan, so we're a smaller country. But we built approximately 1 gigawatt. And if you look at biopower, similarly, the total pay in Scandinavia is about 8 yen per kilowatt hour, twice, the feed-in tariff here is twice as high. We build a lot, very little happens here. Iceland has among the world's lowest electricity prices. They built a lot of geothermal power plants to provide that very low-cost electricity. The price there is about 3 yen per kilowatt hour. The feed-in tariff here is 10 times as high, yet very little is built. Trying to understand what are these homemade unnecessary costs and removing them would be the best way to increase the use of renewable energy in Japan, and at the same time achieving electricity at much lower costs than Japan has traditionally produced electricity from fossil fuels and nuclear, thereby making the Japanese society more wealthy, increase the competitiveness of the electricity using industry, making more electricity available to the households, and also, of course, learning how to do these technologies in an efficient way, fostering a Japanese industry that can provide for the Japanese market as well as for the world market that will grow in these sectors. So I feel confident renewables will go on developing. There are so many countries in the world that do it successfully. It's just a matter of how quickly it will be implemented in different countries and how efficiently. And the advice to anyone, in particular in Japan, is to try to achieve large-scale, fast, efficient penetration by identifying the unnecessary homemade costs and remove them as fast as possible. And then I try to find out who would be against this. Well, I can imagine only one category: the owners of old, inefficient, expensive power plants. And I cannot see that any country can afford to protect the old, inefficient parts of industry. The majority of the people, the majority of industry must be in favor for improved efficiency and improved competitiveness. And I think that will work even in Japan. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. A number of very interesting points. I note you know, saying that our projections of renewable energy in the future are always too low.
Well, they have been so far. But when it comes to solar power, which has also grown dramatically, I was trying to find out whether it was correct to say, as I do dare to say with wind power, that no one had projected a faster growth. But I actually found a vision written in the 1970s by someone who was at the time considered to be completely crazy, but that actually showed a faster growth than what really happened. So I don't dare to say it about solar. But about wind, I don't know of any written projection from the 20th century that's more ambitious than the real development.
I'll mention two projections, actually, and Steve will know these, but the IEA, International Energy Agency, in the year 2000 projected that the global wind market in 2010 would be 35 gigawatts. And in fact, the actual market was 200 gigawatts, or essentially 6 times higher. The World Bank actually projected wind power in China would only reach about 8 gigawatts by 2020. And China already reached 70 gigawatts, or 7 times as much, in 2010. So 10 years early and 7 times more than the World Bank had projected. So
yeah, the IEA used to be in the habit of making projections for wind power penetration 5 years into the future that was generally less than the current installations when they made the projections. But they're much better now, actually. The IEA's, the IEA has come out, you know, renewables has moved up into a full division within the IEA, and they have started the first time last year publishing something called a midterm market report, which is a set of 5 years projections for all the major renewable energy technologies within the IEA countries, which is actually pretty good. It's credible, it's reasonable, it actually is current.
But most projections that we see today, including yours, are likely to be too low.
I hope so.
But you shouldn't extrapolate. Misconceptions have been proven in the past. We don't know if today's are as well. You shouldn't be too confident on that. But that development will go on, costs will be reduced, competitiveness will increase, and sooner or later we will have a sustainable energy supply. But how fast it grows depends on effectiveness of policies. So that's what we should try to improve.
Well, you made the point also about the resistance of existing utility companies, and we do see that resistance already in some places, and particularly it was pointed out to me that this is occurring now in Spain, that utilities, you know, until now, okay, they've gone along with it and it hasn't been a major threat, but now renewables is such a large share and it's really cutting into their revenue, including the revenue of gas companies as well, natural gas companies, that there is a very serious resistance by existing electric utilities in Spain to policies which would further renewables, for example, net metering policies that allow people to sell their electricity even at the existing retail price without any subsidies. And so this type of resistance really from utilities is, and yes, they're being threatened in Germany also. If you own a coal power plant, your revenue is very much in jeopardy because solar is now cutting into such a large part of the daytime market. that you're losing revenue on your fixed assets. So this does seem to become, is going to become a big issue, presumably here, including in Japan. I wonder, in terms of the policies that you mentioned, you know, the need for policy changes now. In terms of Japan, how would you see those policy priorities right now? Just a couple of the main ones that you see that really need to be addressed in these next couple of years to see a 20-year renewable future develop in the way that we've spoken about.
I think the major strategic issue is the re-regulation of the electricity market to ensure that you have a transmission grid and market access guaranteed on fair conditions to all new entrants. That is the most important thing. Then this kind of removal of small obstacles and barriers and unnecessary cost in respective area is something that you have probably hundreds of small decisions that are desired. The method used in Sweden, which I believe is maybe the reason why Sweden was successful last year, was that the government some 5-6 years ago, I think it was, decided to appoint what they called wind power coordinators. These were people with significant experience of how the country worked. Former members of parliaments, former city mayors, people like that with good political contacts and very good knowledge of how the society worked. And they asked them to assist the development of wind power. They each got one region of Sweden. And their role was to help wind power companies in facilitating their contacts with permitting authorities and sometimes with grid companies, but also to feed back the experience from the wind power industry to the government. This was an extremely efficient way of collecting knowledge about where were the unnecessary barriers and rules and regulations that blocked development of wind power that could be removed to make the processes more efficient. I think that's a good idea for others to copy.
Yeah, I would add to that, and would you agree that if we look at the existing feed-in tariff and the need for interconnection with the grid, and let's say for wind power in particular, that right now the utilities can claim that they can't accept the power because of the variable nature and the fact that this will unbalance the grid and so on. I would say that there needs to be some type of independent oversight of the utilities to ensure that they don't claim that falsely, let's say, or that they use that as an excuse to avoid participating in the feed-in tariff.
As an intermediary step before you succeed with unbundling, that might work. They would also go for the justification of the connection fees to be connected to the grid. Regarding the feed-in tariff system itself, I have learned that when you apply to be eligible for feed-in tariffs, you have to specify what you're going to build in great detail. Many of those who have experience from other countries find the demand on detail in these applications ridiculously high. One result is, of course, that you have to spend a lot of time on the application process itself, which is largely an unnecessary cost. But even worse is that when you have been granted your permission, you've been accepted as eligible for feed-in tariffs, and then you have to go and buy the equipment to actually build what you have been allowed to build, then you have specified in such detail that you have to buy from a certain supplier. And then the opportunity to enjoy low prices because of competition is totally destroyed, because the supplier knows that if you go to someone else, you will lose your permit. So you have to pay unnecessary profits to the suppliers. That's another opportunity to change the way that the feed-in tariff permission process is run in a way that would immediately reduce the cost to the investor, and therefore the feed-in tariff could be lower and the whole of Japan could benefit from reduced costs.
Thank you. Steve, any comments on the policy questions?
I agree on that.
Ways we might reduce, you might see costs coming down in the future here in Japan, ways that those costs that Thomas said could be reduced?
I mean, assuming that the country has now taken a decision or is on the verge of having taken a decision that it wants to move towards a competitive market, then I think that in and of itself will send a positive signal, and we'll start to see the benefit of that before the entire unbundling and establishment of a transmission system operator and a regulator is fully complete. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the other part of the costs, some of them necessary and some of them not. I mean, my colleague Mr. Nagata has always amazed me with the simple fact of that in most of the rest of the world, for an onshore wind turbine, onshore wind project, the capital cost of the turbine is 75% or more of the total cost of a wind project. In Japan, it's maybe about 50%. And that's not because turbines here are cheap. On the contrary, they're more expensive, partly because there isn't much competition, but also because they need to be earthquake-proof, they need to be set up to deal with typhoons, they need to be set up to deal with the super lightning regime that is present in some parts of Japan. So, I mean, the EPC costs, the engineering and contracting costs, are extraordinarily high. And this 3-year environmental impact statement requirement that just got dumped on top of that just adds to the cost. So while on a global scale, the 22 cents or 20, whatever it translates at today's rates of the current wind feed-in tariff seems ridiculous, but under the circumstances, I'm sure it's required just to make the projects marginally profitable. And an awful lot of that could be taken out. But we shouldn't underestimate the cost of doing business in general here in Japan, nor the special conditions that need to be met. But having said that, I think it would probably be with a concerted effort of your facilitators and with some legislative teeth, you could probably knock the price down to half in not too long.
But when you see that civil engineering costs, for example, are much higher in Japan than elsewhere, if I was in the Japanese government, I would be concerned because, of course, that is something that you could influence by creating conditions for better competition and by reducing what is then unnecessary costs in the civil engineering sector, you would make the Japanese economy more efficient and you would improve the living conditions in general. So I think this is also what I've heard that the LDP wants to do, to vitalize these sectors in Japan. So let's help them by using the renewable energy sector as the source of the benchmark data necessary to take on these issues. I'm naive, you know, it's sometimes very constructive.
Your tongue is rather firmly placed in your cheek at the moment, but that's okay.
Well, China became a global wind power leader in really just 6 years, from nothing, from about 2006 to 2012, in terms of total capacity. And they did that partly through policy, but also through industry changes. And we're seeing a lot of developing countries also, emerge as wind power leaders. Now India has been for a long time, and possibly Brazil and other countries in South America. I wonder if they're going through the same things that Japan now has to face, or there are lessons from any of these countries that you think might apply here in the future. I'm just sort of thinking on a broad global scale.
Well, we can all learn something from Brazil, in the sense that they are the first ones that I know of who have put together an auction system that really, really works for wind energy on a large scale. But not without having made plenty of mistakes to start with, and not without looking at all of the other auction systems that have basically failed around the world over the last couple of decades. It's still relatively early days. I mean, Brazil has just passed 2 gigawatts now, so it's only about 3 or 4 years of development. It's almost to the size of Japan's total installed capacity. So I'd wait for another couple of years before using it as absolute examples of a successful way to do that. I think in established economies like this, then a feed-in tariff is probably an easier way to get things started. But the pricing mechanism is one small part of the regulatory framework, which will determine. I mean, you can have a perfect feed-in tariff and still nothing gets built. Yeah. And you can, like in Turkey, you have a really crap, very low feed-in tariff. Nobody uses it, but they're building like crazy because they can sell the electricity into the spot market at a better price. And they're becoming a very competitive market in Turkey there through no government planning at all, or through bad government planning. They went straight to the market, and that works better. So every market is different, and it's very hard to say. I mean, we'll see what happens in South Africa now that they're seriously underway. It's yet another model, one which there's very high local content requirements, and there's a very strong imperative there to build a local industry and create local employment is almost a stronger imperative for them than the benefits of indigenous wind energy production.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. And I think one of the things from the Global Futures report also is that many experts have said, we're going to see very large markets for renewable energy in developing countries. And the alliance among developing countries, among themselves, with China and also with Europe and potentially Japan, could become very significant in the future. Well, we're out of time. Our session is now bringing to a close. And I would just like to invite all of us to work together towards a renewable energy future, both globally and here in Japan. I'd like to see us monitor progress with this type of conference as we go year by year. And also, I would encourage you to read the Renewables Global Futures Report. I have printed copies here. Actually, the Japanese translation just came out yesterday. So if you're interested, I can give you a printed copy now, or you can find it on the web very easily with Google. So thank you very much to Thomas and Steve for an interesting session.
スピーカーの皆さん、そしてモデレーターのマーティノーさん、ありがとうございました。今一度
Thank you very much, the speakers, as well as Mr. Martino, the moderator. And so this brings us to the end of the last session, session 4. Thank you very much for taking part with us in this symposium, the Revision 2013. And so we have from the JREF, Mr. Sueyoshi.
皆様、長時間にわたりお疲れ様でございました。
Thank you very much for spending so much time with us. We started at 9:30 in the morning, so it's already been 8 hours of discussions. And I arrived here at 8:30, and I saw that some of you had been lined up outside of the hall. That means you probably spent close to 9 hours with us at this symposium, and with the very active participation of the speakers. I am happy to say that we are now coming to the close of this symposium. I would like to express my gratitude to the members who had gathered here from within and outside of Japan to join us here for today, as well as the experts meeting we had yesterday. Now, JREF does sponsor many large-scale conferences. This is the fourth of the such large-scale conferences, and we have been involved in many other activities as well. And I believe that we have really witnessed a major change having taken place in the last 18 months in Japan towards the acceptance of renewable energies. There are still voices who are saying that we don't need renewable energies, but we have seen the onset of the feed-in tariff system, and we cannot avoid
considering the renewable energies. Now, Mr. Ehara has mentioned today, he said that while the entire world is progressing, we are being very stagnant here in Japan. That might be what is happening in Japan. And so what you have heard today is just a witness to the fact that we have so many problems, some major issues, some are small problems, some which need to be solved in the short term, some which require a longer outlook. And so what should we do in order for us to be able to get the ball rolling in terms of the introduction of renewable energies? And so we would like to turn our eyes to Europe as well as United States, who are able to show us some good examples. So we will be able to make the right decisions. And so it's not a matter of whether or not we should develop renewables. It's the question of how to do this. So what is it that we need to learn from these countries? What is it that we should not repeat in terms of mistakes that have already been made? And so I have noted a few things as I listened to the talk today. And so let me refer to the memo that I have made in referring to what I have noticed. We first of all need to have a very clear number set to set a target or a goal. Now we set 19.4% for 2030, and I don't know whether that goal is the most appropriate goal or not. We don't know. Listening to Germany's case, they already have 20%. In 2020, they're going for 35%, and then going to 80% in 2050, or in some European countries they are aiming for 100%. So the question here is whether the target that we are setting ourselves is correct, or whether we have set the appropriate target. What is it that we need to do in very concrete manners as we go towards these goals? And here are some of my impressions. If we want to grow the renewable energies, what are some of the driving horses that we need to choose? When we think of driving force, I think there are two key words here that we have to look at. Now, first of all, we have been preaching security of power supply in Japan. However, at the same time, I think you have also heard the next phrase, that is of an efficiency. How do you create an efficient power system? And this word efficiency is something that should be a key word for us as we try to learn what our driving forces should be. Now, we have spoken about stable and secure supply, but what are we going to, how are we going to do this? We have spoken about the unbundling, or we have been looking at the total cost calculation method up to now. And we could look at efficiency as one keyword, market access, market orientation. How do we ensure access? So what we have been discussing is very different from what we should be aiming for. The second thing, how do we then achieve a alignment in her policy with our plans? Now, in case of Japan, we have been seeing a lot of mismatching of the policies. There have been so much gaps left behind among the various policies, and they have not been filled. In order for us to make innovation reform, maybe the reform that we have been looking at are only superficial or not a true reform. Is it a reform that we are seriously trying to achieve or not? Now, we have to be serious in this. Now that we have the FIT system in a plan, there had been some mention of the fact that it takes 9 years to get your approval to be able to become eligible for FIT, or that you cannot build on farmland, that they require the same specification as you would for skyscrapers. And in countries such as Germany, they made it a requirement that the grid will accept this power. It's not as it's in Japan, where they can only access the grid if there is room for that. In case of Germany, their access was guaranteed, and that is one of the major challenges that we have to face. In the symposium today, I thought that we have much to learn from these examples from Europe and US. And how do we make use of this? How do we then try to take advantage of some of the bad examples that have been shown in the advanced countries. We want to make sure that any issues and vulnerabilities that have been proven in the other markets, we should not be allowed to use that as an excuse for us not to introduce renewables, because we have been doing that. We take these examples, and Harold from Germany has already said that we have already had many bad news. However, these are only short-term issues, and these are seeds for us which we need to take and then try to improve upon. And so we have to learn from the examples we have, and Amory has mentioned the haiku from the Japanese haiku, and in the world there are already countries making leapfrogging advances. Now, in Japan, we do have that power of being able to make leapfrogging advances. However, we shouldn't then stay in this very lukewarm water, not to realize that the water is being heated gradually, and then we find the frogs to their demise, not realizing that or not being wise enough to jump out of that water. And so there is a need to change the business model. I think I was impressed by the fact that much of the mindset of the people have been changed. Now, in case of 50 Hertz company, there is this totally new business of operating TSOs, and now they're expanding that business or business models. Or the countries or industries, for example, auto or IT industry, which have not been interested in energy industry in the past, may find some new areas that they could be interested in. So the mindset of the business person should be that you can't do this because there are so many regulations against it. That's not what a business person should do. You have to take that as a business chance, because converting what is not allowed, or what people have said no to, converting that to something possible, to a yes, is what a business person should be doing. And if the business persons or the Japanese industry could do that, then that will allow us to make a much more important impact upon the world. Thomas Colbert has said yesterday, no gains in protecting the existing technology, is what he has said. And so it's not that we should be protecting that conventional technology that we have. That is not going to bring about any success. The only new business models could be invented if we look at the challenges. As Eric mentioned at the very end, the specialists in the world are seeing that there are funds ready to make their investment into some new innovative ideas. And according to REN 21's statistics, new money of 1 trillion yen have been invested into this industry. According to Javier from Spain, international money is looking for many more opportunities to invest in terms of renewable energy. And so I believe that it has already started to change the business throughout the world. It's not contained only within the energy market. It's also impacting other industries. So we should stop trying to look for excuses not to do renewable energies. We should be out there seeking excuses to be involved in the industry, because that is only the only way which will allow us to make any progress. Don't keep saying that we have special circumstances in Japan. We can't use that as an excuse anymore. And Annegret from Germany has said repeatedly that Energiewende has already started. And that has been in Germany the biggest scale reform that has ever taken place happening in Germany since the war. And so who are going to be the competitors for Japan in the future? Probably Germany is going to be our major competitor in Europe. And if Germany is looking at that energy transition as the biggest challenge ever since the war, then that's not something that we could ignore here in Japan. And so there are two things that I should like to mention, something we should not forget. One thing is Fukushima. And as was mentioned in Mr. Son's address at the beginning, we shall not forget Fukushima. We cannot forget Fukushima when we think about the energy issue, when we think about the future of Japan. We may not stop thinking about Fukushima. And furthermore, we are seeing the advances in the global warming, and we are seeing these global climate changes have brought about much calamity, natural calamity, to many of the regions of the world, and we will probably see that again this year. Thomas mentioned President Obama's speech from the State of the Union address, and I remember his inauguration address in January. He said that the modern generation, we have to take action against the climate change. Because if we don't do that, our future generation, or it's going to be a betrayal of our children and the future generation if we do not think about the climate change. And so that's the reason why, because we have to always bear in mind Fukushima as well as climate change in Japan, that we have to think about the renewables. As Mr. Nagata mentioned, can we not attach some value to wind power other than money? I think that kind of approach is what we need. And we are talking about the best mix of energy. Now, we should be looking at the best energy mix, but no one has explained what is it the best for. What sort of people is that the best energy mix? What opportunity is that the best energy mix for? We really haven't discussed that. And Mr. Kajima said that information should be disclosed. We need transparency. Mr. Takahashi mentioned that there has to be a ethical responsibility for the future, and it needs to be a arena for very fair discussions. And we need to be given a freedom to choose our energies. And so if we want to do that, it's really important for Japan to be able to discuss and talk about renewables. And it's also important to secure democracy for Japan. Eric said that we in Japan may be 10 or 20 years behind the other nations, so we are really out of date. And I think many of you listening here today have probably agreed with this view, but I don't think we like to hear that we are behind the rest of the world by 10, 20 years. It's not very pleasant to hear that. Now, Emery mentioned, and he referred to IEA's Mr. Bureau, and I visited him at his office in January, and he mentioned that we must leave oil before it leaves us. So we have to leave, or we have to try to get away from that reliance or dependence on fossil fuel. So, in English, if we look back on what's already passed, we need to have a rear view mirror to be able to do that. And I guess the Europeans are now driving ahead of us or watching us in their rear view mirror. So what we want to become is to be the driver in that car, watching the rest of the world through the rear view mirror. And we need to have a thorough discussion on this, and we also need to look at reality in the eye, then try fully understand why it is that we need to tackle this challenge of the utilization of renewables. Thank you very much once again for joining us today in our meeting. And it's been 6 or 18 months since we started our activities. In the middle of the year, we will be celebrating our second anniversary, and we'll be going into our third year. And so I hope that you will give us your cooperation and assistance so that we will have a healthy growth of renewable energy in Japan. And so thank you once again for staying with us for such a long time. I'd like to express my heartfelt gratitude to you, and I hope that you yourselves will engage yourselves and try to make money off the industries which are going to be introducing renewable energies. And thank you very much.
Thank you. So with this, the program for today is complete. Thank you very much for coming to this international conference, Revision 2013, despite your busy schedules. And also do fill in the questionnaire and hand it over to any staff member. And also please return the simultaneous interpretation receivers when you leave the hall. And concerning the various materials slides, they will be put on the homepage for JREF. And the various reports are available at the entrance as well. Thank you very much.
誠にありがとうございました。どうぞお手回り品、お忘れ物などございませぬようお気をつけてお帰りくださいませ。本日のご来場、誠にありがとうございました。